17,309 seconds. That is how long the calculating engines screamed before they stopped. I was in tertiary observation when it happened, not watching the void, but monitoring the secondary power distribution relays for fluctuations that hadn't occurred in 6 months of recorded data. The scream came through the deck plating first. Not sound. Vibration. The kind that makes your jaw ache and your teeth feel loose in their sockets. The kind that travels up through your boots and settles somewhere in your chest where it shouldn't be. Then the lights stuttered. Then we dropped. I should explain what dropping feels like. Most crew describe it as a lurch, like missing a step in darkness. That is not accurate. That is what people say because the human mind requires metaphors for experiences it cannot properly process. Dropping from faster-than-light travel when the transition is controlled feels like nothing. The human nervous system cannot register the shift because it occurs within parameters the body recognizes as normal, or close enough to normal that the brain simply accepts it and moves on. When it is uncontrolled, when something catastrophic fails and the field collapses without preparation, without the graduated deceleration sequence that usually cushions the transition, your body tries to process a change it was never designed to comprehend. My vision went white, not from light, not from any external stimulus, from my brain attempting to interpret spatial data that had stopped making sense. The visual cortex, receiving contradictory information from my eyes and inner ear and proprioceptive system, simply gave up and flooded my consciousness with undifferentiated signal. I vomited. So did everyone else in tertiary observation. 7 people total, all of us bent over, retching onto deck plating that had been clean moments before. The klaxons started 4 seconds later. By then, I was already checking the chrono, logging the timestamp out of habit and training, and because my hands needed something to do besides shake. The last time I would log anything into a functioning network for a very long time. The calculating engines are housed in the deep core, 7 decks down from tertiary observation, shielded behind enough adamantium plating that most crew never see them during their entire service aboard. I had seen them once, during my initial orientation 14 months prior, when I was still learning the ship's layout and trying to memorize the location of every major system in case of emergency. They filled a chamber the size of a manufacturing district, rows upon rows of cogitating cylinders, each one 30 meters tall, covered in cooling tubes and data conduits that pulsed with transmitted information, creating a visual rhythm like breathing, if breathing were mechanical and infinite. The air in that chamber tasted like copper and ozone, and something else I couldn't identify, something that made the back of my throat feel tight. The Mechanicus tech priest who escorted me through did not speak. He simply gestured at the machines with one augmetic hand and made a clicking sound that might have been approval or warning, or simply a vocalization his modified larynx produced without conscious intent. I did not ask which. I had learned by then that questions aboard the enduring testimony were logged, reviewed, and factored into your efficiency rating, and that too many questions marked you as someone who required additional supervision. I mentioned the engines because understanding what failed requires understanding what they were. They did not simply calculate trajectories. That is what I had thought initially, what most crew thought, that the calculating engines plotted courses from one point to another, like drawing lines on a map. But they processed environmental data from 10,000 sensors simultaneously, adjusted for gravitational variance across multiple stellar masses, stellar drift accumulated over centuries, warp current fluctuations that changed moment to moment, and the accumulated navigational errors of every jump the ship had made since its commission 4 centuries ago. Every calculation built on previous calculations. Every correction factored in previous corrections. The system was designed with redundancy at every level. Tertiary backups for the secondary backups. Fail-safes that would trigger automatic correction protocols if primary systems degraded beyond acceptable parameters. When they screamed, it meant every redundancy had failed at once. When they stopped, it meant we were drifting in whatever direction our momentum had carried us when the field collapsed. The first announcement came 9 minutes after the drop. I had made it to my designated emergency station by then, a secondary monitoring node near the portside cargo distribution junction. A small compartment with 4 terminals and enough space for approximately 20 crew to stand if they stood close together. 16 other crew were already there when I arrived, most of them still wiping vomit from their uniforms with whatever cloth they had available. Nobody spoke. We had all been through emergency drills. We knew the protocols. Wait at your station. Monitor your systems. Await instruction. The compartment smelled like stomach acid and fear. We waited. The Vox system crackled, and the voice of First Officer Castellan came through with the kind of measured calm that actually makes your stomach clench tighter than any scream would, because you can hear the effort it requires. All hands attend. We have experienced an uncontrolled translation event. Primary navigational systems are non-responsive. Engineering divisions are working to assess the situation. We are no longer... He paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds. I counted them. In that silence, 17 crew members in one small compartment held their breath. We are no longer receiving astropathic relay. Engineering divisions are to report to their section chiefs immediately. All other crew maintain emergency stations and await further instruction. The enduring testimony remains structurally sound. Hull integrity is intact. We will restore function and proceed. Castellan out. The man to my left, a rating whose name I had never learned despite passing him in corridors for 14 months, made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Someone behind me told him to shut up. He did. We waited another 20 minutes before the section chief arrived. A senior tech adept named Varul, who had been aboard the enduring testimony longer than anyone in our section. Long enough that portions of his body had been replaced with augmetics that showed signs of wear. He did not look at us when he spoke. Rationing protocols are in effect immediately. Food, water, and atmosphere are now calculated resources. You will receive updated allotments within the hour. No one enters the lower decks without authorization. No one accesses primary systems without clearance. Questions will be addressed through proper channels. He turned to leave, then stopped. His back was still to us. We are attempting to re-establish calculating engine function. Until then, we drift. You are to continue standard duties where possible. Panic is a failure of discipline. Dismissed. We dispersed to our stations, those of us who still had stations that meant anything. My role was environmental monitoring, tracking air quality, temperature regulation, humidity levels, across 64 sectors of the ship. I accessed my terminal and began running diagnostics. Everything read normal. The enduring testimony was still breathing, still warm, still maintaining the precise atmospheric conditions that kept 15,000 crew alive. But the network felt different, smaller. Sections that should have reported data were simply absent from my display. I queried the system for Cargo Bay 12. No response. I tried Engineering Section 7. The same absence. We had been partitioned. Whole sections of the ship had been isolated, their systems cut off from general access to preserve processing power for critical functions. I logged it in my personal files and continued my diagnostics. The rationing notification came through an hour later, exactly as Varul had promised. My daily water allotment had been reduced by 30%. Food by 40%. The notice included a detailed table calculating projected supply duration based on current crew population and consumption rates. At reduced allotment, we had 417 days of water, 392 days of nutrient paste. The table included a footnote in small text at the bottom. Calculations assume no resupply and current crew population. Adjustments will be made as circumstances develop. I read the footnote 3 times before I understood what adjustments will be made meant. I stared at my terminal for a period I did not measure, then closed the notification and returned to my environmental monitoring. I had been aboard the Enduring Testimony for 14 months. Before that, I had served on a system patrol frigate for 2 years, and before that, I had trained at the Hydrofer Naval Academy for 3 years after my selection from the Scholar, at age 15. I mention this because it explains what I was before. I remembered my instructors' faces. I remembered Proctor Venn, who taught void navigation, and had a scar across his left cheek that he never explained. I remembered the particular smell of the academy dormitories, a combination of industrial cleaning solution and too many bodies in too little space, and the recycled air that never quite moved fast enough. I remembered my mother's hands. She had been a mid-level administratum clerk on a hive world whose name I was never told after my selection, because children selected for scholar training were property of the institution and previous connections were considered irrelevant to function. Her hands had been small and always cold, even in the climate-controlled archive where she worked. She held my face the day the scholar representatives came, and her hands were shaking. That was the last time I saw her. I was 8. I had archived this memory intentionally, reviewed it once each month during my personal time allotment to ensure the details remained clear and accessible. It was the last piece of a life that preceded service. The cold started on the 3rd day. Not everywhere. Not in any pattern that made immediate sense. Just certain sections. The environmental monitoring system showed normal temperatures across all zones. 18 degrees Celsius, standard for crew compartments. 22 for engineering spaces where the heat from systems required compensation. But the crew in forward storage reported otherwise. I verified their location data and cross-referenced with my sensor readings. The discrepancy was 0.7 degrees Celsius. Not enough to trigger alerts. Not enough to register as a systems failure. But enough that crew working 8-hour shifts would notice, would feel the difference even if they couldn't articulate why the space felt wrong. I reported it to Varul. He told me to monitor and log. I monitored. I logged. By the 5th day, the discrepancy had grown to 1.3 degrees. By the 7th day, forward storage crew were requesting additional thermal layers from ship stores. By the 10th day, they stopped requesting. The cold had spread to adjacent sections, and additional thermal layers were no longer being distributed. The silence was not immediate. For the first week, crew still spoke in passageways, still gathered in rest areas during off-shifts, still maintained the background noise of human density, conversations about duties, complaints about rations, the small exchanges that confirm you are surrounded by other conscious beings. But conversations grew shorter. Laughter stopped. The jokes that usually circulated through crew quarters disappeared. By the 2nd week, the ship felt muffled, like sound was being absorbed by something we couldn't see. People moved through their duties without speaking unless function required it. I passed the same crew members daily in corridors, and we did not acknowledge one another. This was not hostility, it was conservation. Every interaction required energy, and energy had become a calculated resource, like water and food and the air we breathed. The first fight occurred on day 16. I did not witness it directly. I heard it through the deck plating while I was conducting an inspection 3 sections away. The distinctive impact sounds of bodies slamming into metal, then boots running, then shouting that resolved into words I couldn't distinguish through the bulkheads. The Vox system crackled an hour later. First Officer Castellan again, his voice slightly less measured than before. 2 crew had been confined for violent altercation over food distribution. Both had been reduced to minimum rations for 7 days as disciplinary action. Future incidents would result in harsher measures. We were expected to maintain discipline. The Imperium servants did not brawl like underhive gangers over scraps. We continued our duties. I met Kale on day 19. Not met. Noticed. I had seen him before, certainly. The enduring testimony held 15,000 crew, but patterns emerge over time. You recognize faces in corridors, bodies at adjacent stations during shift changes, the particular way someone moves through a hatchway because everyone moves slightly differently when they've adapted to shipboard life. Kale worked in the lower engineering sections, somewhere in the throng of tech adepts and ratings who maintained the plasma relays that powered the ship's systems. I noticed him because he was singing. Not loudly, not even clearly enough to distinguish melody from humming. I was running a manual inspection of atmospheric scrubbers in Junction 14 when I heard it, a low humming sound that resolved into fragments of melody as I moved closer to the source. He was crouched beside an access panel, running a cleaning solution over conduit housings that probably hadn't been manually cleaned in years, maybe decades. His hands moved in steady rhythm while he hummed, treating the task like it mattered, like we weren't drifting lost through uncharted void with failing systems and dwindling supplies. The sound was so fundamentally wrong in that environment, that casual expression of something besides function, that I could not immediately process it. I stopped walking. I stood there in the corridor, watching him work and hum and clean conduits that didn't need cleaning. He looked up, saw me watching, stopped humming. We stared at each other for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "Atmospheric regulation?" I nodded. "Junction inspection. Your engineering. Plasma relay maintenance. They have us cleaning secondary systems now that..." He gestured vaguely upward, indicating the dead calculating engines somewhere above and behind us in the ship's architecture. Keeping us busy. Keeping busy keeps you from thinking too much about where we are. Or where we aren't. He returned to his work, started humming again, quieter this time. I completed my inspection and left. But I logged the encounter in my personal files. Not the official duty logs. Those were reviewed by superiors, and any notation of aberrant behavior could result in disciplinary action. My personal files. I noted the time, the location, the particular melody fragment I had heard. I did not know why I noted it. I told myself it was aberrant behavior worth monitoring, in case it escalated into something requiring official report. That was not why I noted it. The calculating engines remained silent. Each day, Castellan's announcements grew shorter, his tone flatter, the pauses between words slightly longer. Engineering teams were working continuously. Progress was being made. Crew were to maintain confidence in the ship's systems and the officers' ability to restore function. Resources remained adequate for extended operations. We would restore function. We would proceed. By day 23, he stopped mentioning progress. By day 27, the announcements came every 3 days instead of daily. By day 30, we understood without anyone stating it directly that no one knew how to fix what had broken. The tech priests had been attempting every diagnostic procedure in their archives. The calculating engines had sustained damage that went beyond mechanical failure. Something fundamental had corrupted. Something that couldn't be repaired by replacing components or recalibrating systems. The tech priests had been in the engine chamber since the drop. Rumors circulated. Always rumors in the absence of official information. Rumors spreading through crew quarters like infection that they had not left at all. that they were conducting continuous diagnostic procedures and recalibration attempts without pause, cycling through duty shifts by simply replacing exhausted priests with fresh ones, while the work continued uninterrupted. Some crew claimed to have heard sounds from the deep core, chanting, mechanical rhythms. I did not hear it. I did not access those sections. But the calculating engines remained silent, and the ship continued drifting, and we had no way of knowing where we were drifting toward, or how far we had already gone from any charted territory. I encountered Kale again on day 34. Same junction, different task. He was rerouting a coolant line that had developed a slow leak. Nothing critical, but leaks in a closed system meant lost resources, and we were conserving everything now. I was checking humidity levels in the section because the leak was causing atmospheric changes that my sensors had flagged. He saw me and nodded, did not speak immediately. Neither did I. We worked in parallel for several minutes, each focused on our respective tasks, before he said without looking up, "Do you think they know? Engineering, anyone, command, the tech priests. Do you think anyone aboard this ship actually knows where we are?" I considered not responding. The question bordered on the kind of doubt that could be reported, should be reported. Doubt undermined discipline. Discipline was all that kept 15,000 crew from tearing the ship apart section by section. But I was too tired to care about should. "No," I said. He nodded slowly, continuing to work on the coolant line. "We could be anywhere, could have drifted." He stopped, started again, choosing different words. "Could be light years off any charted route. Could be drifting for years before we intersect anything that would even register on passive sensors. If we intersect anything. Conserve resources appropriately, and we have over a year of supplies. You believe that calculation?" I did not answer. The calculation assumed current crew population. The calculation assumed no additional system failures. The calculation assumed supplies didn't spoil or degrade or get contaminated. The calculation assumed many things that might not remain true. He did not ask again. We finished our respective tasks in silence. As I was leaving, he said, "Junction 14, third watch, every 5 days. If you need to hear something that isn't an engine, or a klaxon, or silence." I logged it, not in official files, personal. I logged the time, the location, the offer. I did not log whether I would return. The dreams started around day 40. Not dreams, that implies sleep. And sleep had become irregular for most of the crew. The environmental controls were supposed to maintain regular lighting cycles to preserve circadian rhythms, but crew had noticed the cycles stretching, the periods of illumination growing shorter, and the periods of darkness growing longer. No official announcement addressed this. We adapted. We slept when we could no longer stay conscious, woke when we had to, or when our shift timers activated. Worked until exhaustion took us again. In the periods between, when I lay in my bunk in darkness that might have been scheduled night, or might have been system conservation, or might have been something else entirely, I would experience a sensation of falling. Not the drop. Different, slower, endless. As though gravity had inverted and I was descending into the hull plating instead of resting on it, sinking through solid metal into something below. I would open my eyes and the darkness would be absolute. Emergency lighting had been reduced to conserve power, leaving only small indicators at floor level every 10 meters, and I would not be able to determine which direction was down. The sensation would last until I physically touched the bunk frame and re-established spatial reference. My hand on metal. Metal that was solid and present, and not moving even though everything felt like it was falling. I asked the medical officer about it during a routine health inspection on day 46. He listened to my description without expression, marking something on his data slate while I spoke. When I finished, he said, "Spatial disorientation. Common in extended void deployment. You are experiencing extended void deployment under non-standard conditions. Your neurological systems are attempting to process environmental data that has become ambiguous. The normal reference points your brain uses to maintain spatial awareness are absent or contradictory. Maintain regular duty schedules. Physical activity helps re-establish proprioceptive function. Is anyone else reporting this?" He looked at me for 3 seconds before responding. "Everyone is reporting this. The fights increased in frequency, not daily, but regularly enough that the pattern was clear. Crew confined for violence, crew confined for theft, food, water rations, thermal layers, anything that might improve individual odds of survival. One man confined for screaming during third watch and refusing to stop when ordered. The confined crew went somewhere. We did not know where. Lower decks, perhaps. Isolated compartments. They did not return to their stations. The crew population counter in the rationing notifications decreased. The supply duration calculations adjusted upward. 283 days of water. 259 days of food. No one discussed this directly. We understood what the adjustments meant. We understood where the confined crew had gone. Kale was in junction 14 on day 51. I found him sitting against the bulkhead, his tools spread around him in a semicircle, not working, just sitting, looking at the tools like he'd forgotten what they were for. I had not planned to go there. Junction 14 was not on my inspection route that cycle, but I went. I told myself it was to verify a fluctuation in air pressure readings that might indicate seal degradation in that section. That was not why I went. He looked up when I entered. His face was thinner than I remembered. All our faces were thinner. Rations had been reduced twice more since the initial rationing protocols. We were eating approximately half of what we'd consumed before the drop. The body adapts, but slowly and with cost. "You came," he said. "Pressure readings indicated possible seal degradation in this section." Right. He did not believe me. I did not believe myself. We sat in silence for a period I did not measure. I should have been continuing my inspection route. I should have been logging data. Instead, I sat against the opposite bulkhead and listened to the ship breathe around us. Then he said, "I have been trying to remember colors." I waited. "Not the colors here. Everything here is gray or brown, or that particular shade of metal that isn't quite any color. I mean, actual colors. The sky, somewhere I lived before the Schola, I think. I have a memory of sky, but I cannot remember what color it was. Blue, supposedly. Standard atmospheric scattering produces blue visible spectrum at certain angles when you're looking through nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, but I cannot remember actually seeing it. I remember the concept, not the experience. Memory degradation is common under stress. Is that what this is? Stress?" He laughed, brief and sharp. "We are lost. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Lost. We dropped into a sector with no reference stars, no navigational markers, no astropathic relay. Nothing. We are drifting in absolute darkness, in a direction no one can calculate, and we have, what did the last ration notice say? 273 days of water remaining. 248 days of food. That is not stress. That is inevitability with a countdown. I should have reported him. This was exactly the kind of talk that destabilized crew morale, that could spread through quarters and create panic. This was defeatism. This was accurate. Entirely accurate. I said nothing. "Do you have anyone?" he asked. "Anyone you think about? Anyone who mattered before all this?" My mother's hands, cold, shaking, holding my face. "Yes." "Do you remember their face?" I did. I had reviewed that memory 19 days ago, during my last personal time allotment, before time allotments became irregular. But when I tried to retrieve it now, tried to see my mother's face in my mind, the details felt soft, imprecise, like looking at something through distorted glass. My mother's face. I knew I remembered it. I had the memory file. But the act of remembering had become distinct from the memory itself. Accessing the file was not the same as experiencing the memory. "Yes," I said again. It might have been a lie. I was not certain. Kale nodded slowly. "I had a brother, 2 years older. He was selected for the Guard. I was selected for naval technical training. We were separated at the same scholar intake, directed to different facilities for different roles. I remember his name, Davir. I remember standing in the selection line and watching him be directed to a different transport. I remember that he looked back once before the transport door closed, but I cannot remember his face. I know I saw his face every day for 13 years before selection. We shared bunks. We ate together. I must have looked at his face thousands of times. But it is gone now. Just gone. We sat. The junction hummed with background systems. Somewhere in the walls, coolant flowed through pipes. Somewhere deeper, air circulated through ducts. Somewhere deeper still, the calculating engines sat silent in their massive chamber, surrounded by tech priests who prayed and diagnosed and could not make them speak. Kale started humming, the same melody fragment I had heard before, on day 19. I listened until my shift timer indicated I was overdue for my next inspection. I stood. He stopped humming and looked up. "Junction 14, he said. "Every 5 days, 3rd watch." "Logged," I said. Then, before I could reconsider, "Thank you." His expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something neither of us could name. "3rd watch," he said again. I left. I did not log the conversation officially. I logged it personally, with timestamp and full transcript, every word I could remember. I reviewed it 3 times before my next rest cycle. I am reviewing it now as I record this testament. The file remains intact. The memory has degraded. By day 60, the ship had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify in official reports. The temperature had dropped in most sections, not uniformly. Some compartments remained warm. Others felt cold enough that crew reported seeing their breath. The humidity levels fluctuated. The air smelled different, staler, thicker, like it had been breathed too many times. My monitoring systems showed parameters within acceptable range, but the crew's experience contradicted the data. I reported the discrepancies. Varul told me the systems were functioning correctly. If crew reported discomfort, that was a subjective experience, not a systems failure. I logged it and continued monitoring. The lighting cycles had become entirely irregular. Sometimes we had 18 hours of illumination, followed by 6 hours of darkness. Sometimes 12 and 12. Sometimes the lights simply went out for periods that could have been minutes or hours, and came back on without explanation. No announcements addressed this. We adapted. We learned to carry personal illumination devices. We learned to navigate certain sections by touch, in darkness. First Officer Castellan's announcements stopped entirely after day 70. We did not know why. Rumors suggested he had been confined. Other rumors suggested he had died. Still others suggested he had simply stopped believing the words he was required to speak, and silence was preferable to lies. Without announcements, information moved through the ship differently. Crew who worked in command sections would whisper to crew in engineering sections, who would mention it to crew in storage sections. And eventually everyone knew without any official confirmation that the calculating engines could not be repaired. The damage was fundamental. We were drifting. We would continue drifting until we intersected something, or until supplies ran out, or until the ship's systems degraded beyond the point where they could maintain crew survivability. The question became not whether we would die, but when and how. I met Kale in Junction 14 on day 76. He was waiting when I arrived, sitting in his usual position against the bulkhead. He did not look up immediately when I entered. When he did, his eyes took a moment to focus. "I calculated something," he said. I waited. If the ration reductions continue at the current rate, and if the crew population continues decreasing at the current rate, the supplies will last approximately 117 more days. After that, he stopped. After that, decisions will need to be made about who continues to receive rations and who doesn't. That assumes the rate of reduction remains constant. It will accelerate. The crew who are most expendable will be cut off first, then the next tier, then the next, until only essential personnel remain, until the supplies run out even for them. He looked at me directly. "You monitor environmental systems. I maintain plasma relays. Neither of us is essential. We are in the expendable category." I had reached the same conclusion 19 days earlier. I had not spoken it aloud. Hearing someone else say it made it real in a way that private calculation had not. "Yes," I said. "I don't want to die in the dark," he said. "I don't want my last experience to be sitting in some compartment waiting for the air to run out or the cold to stop my heart. I want—" He stopped, started differently. "I want to remember something real before that happens. I want to remember what mattered. You mentioned your brother. I cannot remember his face. I mentioned that. It is gone." His voice was flat. "You mentioned someone. Your mother, I think. Do you still remember?" I tried. I accessed the memory file, my mother's face. The image was there but degraded, corrupted by repeated access or time, or the stress of extended crisis. I could see features. Small nose, dark hair, but the specific configuration that made her face distinct from any other face. That was softening, blurring. "I am losing it," I said. We sat in silence. The ship hummed. After a period I did not measure, Kale said, "When they cut us off, when they decide we are non-essential, I would prefer not to be alone." "You are proposing what?" "That we face it together. Whatever comes, however it comes. Together instead of alone in separate compartments waiting for the end." I should have refused. Attachment was a liability in this situation. Emotional connection, consumed energy, better spent on survival. But survival toward what end? To drift longer in darkness? To extend the period before inevitable termination? I looked at Kale, and he looked at me, and we both understood that we had already decided. "Junction 14, I said. "When it comes." "When it comes," he agreed. I left after another period of silence. I logged the conversation. I logged the agreement. I told myself it was practical arrangement. Facing crisis with another conscious being was operationally more efficient than facing it in isolation. That was not why I agreed. The corridor to Junction 14 became the only route I memorized completely. I could walk it in total darkness now, hand trailing along the bulkhead, counting hatches. 17 from my quarters. 3 junction points. 1 ladder down. 11 more hatches. Then the access panel that opened into 14. I walked it every 5 days during third watch. Sometimes Kale was there. Sometimes he wasn't. When he was absent, I would sit against the bulkhead in the space he usually occupied and wait until my shift timer indicated I needed to return to duty. When he was present, we would sit in silence or speak in fragments about things that didn't matter. The taste of real food from before service. The sound of weather. Memories that were degrading faster now, compressed and corrupted by the prolonged stress of drifting in unmapped void. Day 80. 3 brought the first power failure in my section. Not a fluctuation, complete loss. The lights went out and did not return. Emergency lighting should have activated automatically. It did not. I was in the middle of a diagnostic review when it happened, and the terminal went dark mid-sequence. I sat in absolute blackness for approximately 90 seconds before my eyes began to adjust. They did not adjust. There was no light to adjust to. I activated my personal illumination device, and the thin beam cut through darkness that felt somehow thicker than normal darkness. Like the absence of light had become a physical presence. I completed my inspection by hand, checking each relay manually, and reported the failure to Varro. He acknowledged the report without comment. The power did not return to that section. On day 85, 2 more sections went dark. On day 87, 4 more. The ship was dying in pieces. The crew understood this without official announcements. You could see it in the way people moved through corridors now. Faster, more direct, no wasted motion. You could hear it in the absence of sound. Conversations had stopped entirely, except when operationally necessary. The mess halls were silent during feeding times. Crew would file in, receive their reduced rations, consume them without speaking, and file out. I tried to remember what the mess halls had sounded like before the drop. I could not. I knew there had been sound, voices, utensils on trays, the ambient noise of hundreds of people in one space, but I could not retrieve the actual auditory memory. It was gone. My mother's face was almost completely gone now. I would access the memory file and see only fragments. Dark hair. I was certain of that. Small hands. But the configuration of features, the specific arrangement that had made her distinct from any other woman with dark hair and small hands, lost. I had reviewed the memory too many times. Each access had degraded the file further. I stopped accessing it after day 90. Better to preserve what remained than corrupt it completely through repeated retrieval. Kale was in junction 14 on day 92. He looked worse than I had seen him. His face was not just thin now, but hollow. Skin stretched over bone in a way that suggested the body was consuming itself. We all looked like that. The rations had been reduced again. We were receiving approximately 1/3 of standard allotment. It was not enough to maintain body mass. It was barely enough to maintain consciousness. He did not greet me when I entered. He simply said, "They are selecting." I understood immediately what he meant, but I asked anyway. Selecting what? Who continues receiving rations? Who doesn't? They started 2 days ago. Engineering crews first. Anyone not directly maintaining critical systems was notified their allotments would be suspended. He looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly. I was notified this morning. I have 3 more days of water, 2 more days of food. Then nothing. The information did not surprise me. I had been expecting notification myself. My role monitoring environmental systems was useful but not critical. The systems would continue functioning whether I monitored them or not. I have not been notified yet, I said. You will be. Everyone in the non-essential categories will be. They will process through us systematically until only the crew required to maintain absolutely critical functions remain. He was still looking at his hands. I thought I would be angrier I thought I would. I don't know. Fight. Refuse. Something. But I just feel tired. I sat against my usual bulkhead. The metal was cold. Everything was cold now. Where do they expect us to go? They don't. They expect us to remain in our quarters or designated rest areas and wait. They said we would be made comfortable. That was the phrasing in the notification. Crew members whose rations have been suspended will be made comfortable in designated rest areas. Comfortable. As though dying of dehydration can be comfortable if you do it in the right location. We sat. I tried to think of something to say that would matter. Nothing came. The ship hummed around us, but the hum was different now. Weaker. More irregular. Like the enduring testimony itself was tired. After a period of silence, Kale said, "I do not want to die in a designated rest area." "Where do you want to die?" "Here. Junction 14. Where I could at least hear another person breathing in the darkness. Where I wouldn't be alone with..." He stopped. "With myself. And what I'm becoming." I understood. We were all becoming something we didn't want to examine too closely. The human body, under extreme deprivation, does things. The mind follows. I had caught myself thinking about things I would not have been capable of thinking 3 months earlier. Calculating which crew members would provide the most. I stopped that thought before it completed. But the fact that my mind had started down that path at all told me how far I had degraded. "I will be here," I said. "When? When you need me to be here. When they suspend your rations, I will come to Junction 14, and I will stay until..." "Until what? Until he died? Until I was selected too and we both died?" I did not finish the sentence. "Thank you," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I know that costs you. Time here is time you could use for something else. I know that." "There is nothing else," I said. It was true. My duties continued, but they felt increasingly meaningless. I monitored systems that were failing. I logged data no one reviewed. I reported discrepancies to superiors who acknowledged them and did nothing. The motions of function without its substance. Kale's rations were suspended on day 94. He did not report to his designated rest area. He came to Junction 14 instead and waited. I found him there during third watch, sitting against the bulkhead with his few personal possessions arranged beside him, a data slate that no longer held charge, a maintenance tool whose purpose I didn't recognize, a piece of cloth that might have been part of a uniform from an earlier assignment. He looked up when I entered. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say many things. Following through is different." I sat beside him, not across from him as I usually did, but beside him, against the same bulkhead. Close enough that I could feel the heat from his body, or perhaps it was my own heat. It was difficult to tell anymore. Everything was cold, except the small spaces where bodies were close together. We sat in silence for a period. Then he said, "Tell me something true." "What kind of true?" "Anything. Something from before. Something you remember clearly." I cannot trust my own memories anymore. They have all degraded. But maybe yours are intact. Maybe you can remember something real, and make it real for me too by speaking it. I tried to think of a memory that remained intact. Most had corrupted, but there was one specific moment that I had not reviewed repeatedly, that had simply existed in my memory without conscious reinforcement. "I was 6 years old," I said, "before scholar selection. My mother worked in an administrative archive. Sometimes she would take me to work with her when there was no one to watch me at our hab unit. The archive had..." I paused, accessing the memory carefully. The archive had windows. Real windows, not view screens. They looked out over a lower hive level. I remember standing at one of those windows while my mother processed documents, and I watched the people below, thousands of them, moving through streets in patterns that looked random but weren't. They were going to work, or coming from work, or going to markets. They had purposes, destinations. And I remember thinking how strange it was that every single one of them was a complete person with memories and purposes and lives, and I would never know any of them. They would just be small shapes moving through streets forever. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is beautiful. Sad, but beautiful. It is just a memory. No, it is more than that. It is a moment when you understood something about how large the universe was and how small you were in it. Most people have a moment like that. Most people lose it. You kept it." He shifted slightly, leaning against the bulkhead in a way that suggested exhaustion. "Thank you for sharing it. Do you have one? A memory that remains intact?" He considered. "One. I was perhaps 9 or 10. Before selection, but old enough to understand what selection meant. There was another boy in our scholar preparatory ward. His name was Eric. He was small, smaller than the rest of us. The instructors said he probably wouldn't be selected for anything, that he would be returned to general population for standard labor assignment. We all knew what that meant. Standard labor assignment in a hive world is measured in years until injury or exhaustion. Most don't make it past 30. Eric knew this too. And I remember one night, after lights out, hearing him crying in his bunk, very quietly, trying not to be heard. And I remember lying in my own bunk, thinking I should say something, offer comfort or something. But I didn't. I stayed silent, because comforting him might draw attention to me, might make the instructors think I was too emotionally attached, might reduce my own chances for selection. So I let him cry alone in the darkness, and I said nothing. That is what you remember most clearly. Yes, not my brother's face, not my parents if I had any. That moment of choosing my survival over someone else's suffering. That moment when I learned what I was capable of. Or not capable of. He was quiet for a moment. I think about Eric sometimes. I wonder if he is dead now. He probably is. Standard labor assignment. He would have been worked until he broke. And I am here instead because I was willing to let him cry alone. The Imperium selected me because I had that capacity to witness suffering and do nothing. "You are doing something now," I said. "You chose to be here instead of in a designated rest area. You chose connection over isolation. I chose not to die alone. That is not the same as choosing connection. That is just fear of the end, perhaps. But I am here too, and I chose to be here. That means something." He turned his head to look at me. In the dim emergency lighting, his face was more shadow than feature. "Yes," he said. "It does." We sat together in Junction 14 for the next 4 days. I left only to complete essential duties and collect my own rations, which I shared with Kale despite the risk. Half my water, half my nutrient paste. It was not enough to sustain 2 people. It was barely enough to sustain 1, but it extended the time we had. I did not think beyond that. Day to day had become the only meaningful time frame. Kale's condition deteriorated rapidly after the 2nd day. Dehydration produces specific symptoms: dry mouth, confusion, decreased consciousness, eventually organ failure. I monitored his decline clinically, noting each stage as it progressed. On the 3rd day, he stopped speaking coherently. On the 4th day, he stopped speaking at all. He would look at me occasionally, and his eyes would register recognition, but the connection between thought and speech had severed. I sat beside him and maintained physical contact, my hand on his arm, my shoulder against his shoulder. Contact seemed important. I did not know why. Perhaps it was for him. Perhaps it was for me. The distinction had stopped mattering. He died on the 5th day. I was sitting beside him when his breathing changed, became irregular, then shallow, then stopped. I waited to see if it would resume. It did not. I checked for a pulse at his neck. Nothing. I sat with his body for a period I did not measure. Eventually, I needed to return to duty. I left him there in junction 14, arranged against the bulkhead in a position that approximated rest. I did not report his death. There was no point. The crew population counters would adjust automatically when his biometric implant stopped transmitting. Someone would eventually retrieve the body, or they wouldn't. The ship had more pressing concerns than proper handling of the dead. My ration notification came on day 99. My allotments would be suspended effective immediately. I was to report to designated rest area 7 and await further instruction. I deleted the notification and returned to junction 14. Kale's body was gone. Someone had retrieved it after all. The space where he had died was empty, except for a dark stain on the deck plating that might have been dried blood or might have been any of the various fluids that leak from a body during and after death. I sat in my usual position against the bulkhead and waited. I am not certain how long I waited. My chronometer stopped functioning on day 102, or possibly later. Time became difficult to track. The lighting cycles had become so irregular that I could not use them as reference. I slept when exhaustion overwhelmed me, woke when I could no longer remain unconscious. The thirst was worse than the hunger, worse than the cold. My mouth became so dry that my tongue felt swollen. My lips cracked and bled. I stopped noticing after a while. Pain became a background constant that the mind eventually deprioritizes. I thought about many things during those periods of consciousness. I thought about my mother, though I could no longer retrieve her face. I thought about the instructors at the academy. I thought about Proctor Venn and his unexplained scar. I thought about Kale and his brother Davia, and whether Davia had died somewhere in the Imperial Guard, thinking about Kale the same way Kale had died thinking about him. I thought about the window in the Administratum archive and the thousands of people moving through streets below. All of them with purposes and destinations they would never reach, or had already reached, or were in the process of reaching at this exact moment on a world I would never see again. I thought about the enduring testimony and the 15,000 crew who had been aboard when we dropped. How many remained? 1,000? 500? How many had been selected for suspension? How many had died in the darkness and cold? How many bodies were arranged in compartments throughout the ship, waiting for retrieval that would never come because we had stopped maintaining functions that were not absolutely critical? I thought about the calculating engines in their massive Chamber 7 decks down, silent and dead, surrounded by tech priests who had tried everything in their archives and failed. What had broken them? What catastrophic combination of failures had caused every redundancy to collapse simultaneously? We would never know. The answer was in the engines themselves, and the engines could not be read. I thought about the void outside the hull. Absolute darkness. No stars visible because we had dropped into a region without stars, or because we were between spiral arms where stellar density approaches zero, or because we had somehow translated into a region of space that had never been mapped, because it contained nothing worth mapping. The void did not care. The darkness did not care. We were drifting through it, and the darkness simply received us without notice or concern. I lost consciousness at some point. When I woke, if waking is the correct term for the return of consciousness in that state, something had changed. The ship felt different, quieter, The background hum that had been constant since I first boarded 14 months earlier had not stopped, but diminished, weakened. Like the enduring testimony had expended its last reserves of effort and was now coasting on momentum alone. I tried to stand. My legs would not support me. I tried again, failed again. I remained sitting against the bulkhead in junction 14 and waited for the end to arrive. It arrived slowly. Consciousness became episodic. I would be aware for a period, then not, then aware again, without any sense of how much time had passed between states. During one period of awareness, I noticed the emergency lighting had gone out completely. Junction 14 was absolutely dark. During another period, I noticed I could no longer feel my fingers. During another, I noticed I had stopped feeling thirsty. That should have been concerning. The absence of thirst in late-stage dehydration indicates approaching death, but I felt nothing except a distant curiosity. During what might have been one of my final periods of awareness, I heard something. Not through the Vox system, not through any mechanical means, through the hull itself. A sound like, I am not certain how to describe it, like metal under stress, like something large moving against something larger. Then silence again. I thought I was hallucinating, that my dying brain was manufacturing stimuli to fill the void. But then I felt it, a vibration through the deck plating. Subtle but distinct, the ship was moving differently. Not drifting, moving, being moved. Another sound. Closer. Impact. Something had struck the hull. Not hard enough to breach, hard enough to register. The emergency lighting flickered, went out, came back on, went out again, came back and stayed on. I heard voices in the corridor outside junction 14, real voices. Crew members running, shouting, not screaming, shouting orders, coordinating, responding to something. The hatch to junction 14 opened. Light flooded in, painful after so long in darkness. I could not see who had opened it. The light was too bright. A figure approached, knelt beside me, said something I could not process. Then another figure. Then hands lifting me. Then movement. I lost consciousness. When I regained it, hours later, days later, I do not know. I was in a medical bay. Not the enduring testimonies medical bay. Different. The lighting was different. The equipment was different. The smell was different. A Medicae officer was standing beside my bed, checking readings on a monitor I could not see. He noticed my eyes had opened. "You are stable," he said. His voice had an accent I did not recognize. "Severe dehydration and malnutrition, but you will survive. You are fortunate. Most of the crew we recovered were already dead." I tried to speak. My throat would not cooperate. He held a vessel of water to my lips. I drank. Too fast. He pulled it away. Slowly. "Your system needs to adjust." After another moment, I managed to ask, "Where?" "You are aboard the Emperor's Mandate. We detected your ship on long-range sensors 3 days ago. At first we thought it was a derelict. No active transmissions. Minimal power signature. But when we closed to boarding distance, we detected life signs. 73 of you still alive. Out of..." He checked his data slate. "Out of an initial crew of 15,047. 73 survivors. Out of 15,000. How long?" I asked. "How long were we drifting?" He checked his slate again. "Based on your ship's logs, Approximately 114 days from your translation failure to our detection, you had drifted approximately 47 light-years off any charted route. You were... He paused, choosing words carefully. You were fortunate we were conducting deep-range reconnaissance in this sector. No regular patrol routes come within 100 light-years of your position. 114 days. 47 light-years off course. If the Emperor's mandate had not been conducting reconnaissance, if we had drifted in a slightly different direction, if we had translated a few degrees off our actual trajectory, we would have continued drifting until the last crew member died and the ship became a true derelict, floating forever through unmapped void with 14,977 corpses sealed inside its hull. What happened to the others? I asked. The other survivors. Being treated. Most are in similar condition to yourself. A few had managed to maintain access to limited rations, officers mostly. They were in better physical condition, but significant psychological trauma. All of you will require extended recovery and psychological evaluation before reassignment. Reassignment. The word hung in the air. They would evaluate us, determine if we were still useful, if our experiences had degraded our function beyond acceptable parameters. Those who passed would be reassigned to new vessels, new duties. Those who failed would be, what? Retired to menial labor? Processed out of service? I did not ask. Your ship, the Medicae officer continued. The enduring testimony is being towed to the nearest Imperial station for evaluation. The Mechanicus wants to examine the calculating engines, determine what caused the failure. They say the pattern of damage is unusual. Unprecedented even. Unprecedented. 15,000 crew reduced to 73 survivors because of an unprecedented failure. The word felt obscene. I closed my eyes. I did not want to speak anymore. The Medicae officer seemed to understand. He adjusted something on the medical equipment beside my bed, and I felt consciousness begin to fade again. Before I slipped away entirely, I thought about Kale. About his body arranged against the bulkhead in Junction 14. About his last coherent words, I don't want to die alone. About the fact that he hadn't died alone, that I had been there, that it had mattered. About the fact that it hadn't changed anything. I recovered slowly over the next several weeks. The Medicae staff aboard the Emperor's Mandate were efficient and professional. They restored my fluid levels, gradually increased my caloric intake, monitored my organ function for signs of permanent damage. Physically, I would recover completely. That was what they told me. Any degradation was temporary and reversible. I would be returned to full function. The psychological evaluation came on day 23 of my recovery. A senior officer whose role I did not fully understand, something between confessor and interrogator, though without the theological framing of either, sat across from me in a small interview room and asked questions. How did I feel about my experience? What did I think about during the period of rationing? Did I witness or participate in any actions that violated regulations? Did I maintain faith in the Imperium's systems throughout the ordeal? Did I still possess the conviction necessary to serve? I answered truthfully when truth seemed safe. I lied when it didn't. I told him about my duties monitoring environmental systems. I told him about the progressive failures, the rationing, the cold. I did not tell him about Kale. I did not tell him about Junction 14, or sharing my rations, or sitting beside a dying man, because neither of us wanted to face the end alone. Those details seemed like the kind that would mark me as compromised, as emotionally unstable, as someone whose attachment to another individual had overridden loyalty to institutional function. He asked if I had formed any significant attachments to other crew members during the crisis. I said no. He made a note on his data slate. asked several more questions, made more notes. Finally, he stood and told me I would be cleared for reassignment, pending final medical approval. I had demonstrated acceptable resilience. My testimony contained no significant gaps or inconsistencies. I was still useful. I was reassigned 4 weeks later to a patrol frigate in the segmentum obscurus, as far from the sector where we had drifted as available ships would allow. They did this deliberately, I think, placing survivors in locations disconnected from their trauma, giving us new duties in new contexts where the memories would have no environmental triggers to reinforce them. It was efficient. It made sense. It did not work. I have been aboard the Vigilant for 6 months now. I perform my duties without error. I monitor environmental systems. I log data. I report discrepancies. I maintain the same level of function I demonstrated before the enduring testimony dropped. My superiors have noted no deficiency in my performance. I am, by all measurable standards, an acceptable crew member. But I think about Junction 14 constantly. I think about Kale's face in the darkness. I think about the sound of his breathing becoming irregular, and then stopping. I think about the fact that 73 of us survived out of 15,000, and the only reason we survived was random chance. A reconnaissance vessel happened to be conducting operations in a sector it had no particular reason to be in, detected a ship that had no particular reason to be detectable, and closed to boarding distance before the last of us died. I think about the 14,977 crew members who were not random chance fortunate. The ones who died in designated rest areas or confined compartments or at their duty stations when the cold or hunger or thirst finally stopped their hearts. The ones whose bodies were probably still aboard the enduring testimony when it was towed to the Mechanicus station. The ones who would be processed as casualties, their names logged in mortality records, their service concluded with appropriate notation. I think about the fact that their deaths meant nothing to anyone except themselves and whatever few connections they had managed to maintain before the end. The Imperium recorded the loss of a ship and 14,000 crew. It adjusted logistics calculations. It reassigned resources. It continued. It always continues. That is what the Imperium does. It continues regardless of cost, because the cost is irrelevant when measured against scale. I am recording this testimony now because I need to document what happened in Junction 14. What happened to Kale. What almost happened to me. Not for any official purpose. This recording will never be submitted as part of any report, but because someone should speak it. Someone should confirm that Kale existed, that he died badly and afraid in the darkness of a failing ship 47 light-years from any location that mattered, that he spent his final conscious moments trying to remember his brother's face and could not, that he died with my hand on his arm, because neither of us wanted to be alone at the end, even though being together changed nothing about the end itself. Someone should confirm that the enduring testimony held 15,000 crew members who were people with memories and purposes and lives, and that they were reduced to resource allocation calculations when the ship's systems failed, that the distinction between those who survived and those who died was mostly chance, that loyalty and faith and discipline meant nothing when set against catastrophic systems failure and random drift through unmapped void. Someone should confirm that the machinery of the Imperium consumes people completely, that we are components in systems too large to comprehend their own scale, that when we fail or break or simply drift into darkness, the machine notes the loss and continues, because stopping is not in its design. I am that someone. This is that confirmation. I exist now in a state of continuing function. I wake, I perform duties, I sleep, I wake again. The cycle repeats, without variation or meaning beyond its own repetition. I am useful. I am functional. I serve, but I remember Junction 14. I remember Kale's breathing stopping in the darkness. I remember the absolute certainty during those final days that we would all die unmourned and unmissed, and that nothing about our deaths would matter to anyone, and that the universe would continue its expansion and rotation without the slightest indication that 15,000 lives had been spent achieving nothing except demonstrating that catastrophic failure is always possible. I remember, and the remembering changes nothing. The enduring testimony is being analyzed by the Mechanicus. They will determine what failed. They will implement corrections to prevent similar failures in other vessels. The system will improve fractionally. It will continue. I will continue with it, performing functions assigned to me, maintaining acceptable efficiency, surviving until I don't. This is what remains. This is what service becomes when you have witnessed the machinery operating without its usual concealment. You understand what you are. You understand what the Imperium is. You understand that the distance between functioning and failing is measured in random chance and catastrophic systems collapse. You understand all of this completely. And you continue anyway, because continuing is all that remains. Junction 14 is empty now. Kale's body has been processed. The dark stain on the deck plating has probably been cleaned. The compartment serves its function as a minor systems junction on a ship that no longer functions. Eventually, the enduring testimony will be either restored or scrapped. Either way, Junction 14 will cease to exist as the location where someone died badly while trying to remember what mattered. But I remember the exact configuration of shadows in that space. I remember the particular sound the ship made in that section, slightly higher pitched than other sections, a resonance created by the specific arrangement of conduits in the walls. I remember how cold the deck plating felt. I remember Kale's voice saying, "I don't want to die alone," and the fact that I could not prevent his death, but could at least prevent the alone part. I remember all of it. The file is degrading. Memory always degrades, but I access it carefully, preserving what remains. Because someone should remember. Because Kale deserved better than dying in absolute darkness, 47 light years from anything that mattered. Because the 14,977 others deserved better than becoming casualty statistics. Because we all deserved better than the machinery of the Imperium grinding forward over our bodies. But deserve is not relevant. The machine does not consider deserve. It considers function. It considers resource allocation. It considers the continued operation of systems that must continue operating, because the alternative is collapse on a scale that would dwarf our individual deaths. So we continue. I continue. I monitor environmental systems aboard the Vigilant. I log data. I report discrepancies. I perform my designated function within the vast machinery of the Imperium. I am useful. I am expendable. The distinction is meaningless. And in whatever time remains to me, before the next catastrophic failure, or the next random chance, or the simple accumulated degradation of service eventually stops my continuation. I remember Junction 14. I remember Kale. I remember that for a brief period, in absolute darkness, two people chose connection over isolation, and that it mattered even though it changed nothing. This is my testimony. This is what total navigational failure in the endless void costs. Not just the lives lost, not just the ship drifting until random chance intercepts it, but the absolute certainty it creates that you are alone in a universe too large to notice your suffering, and that the machinery you serve will continue grinding forward, whether you survive or not. We drifted for 114 days. 73 of us survived. The rest are processed casualties. The system noted the loss and continued. I am still here. I am still continuing. I do not know why that matters. But I am recording it anyway. For the record, for posterity, for the possibility that someone else who survives something similar will hear this testimony and understand they are not alone in understanding what we truly are, components in a machine that does not love us, that cannot love us, that simply requires us until it doesn't. And we continue, because continuation is all we have left.